Beneath the golden chandeliers of Newport's grandest mansion, a seamstress was summoned for a single night's work. Hidden in the shadows, she expected only silence, needle, and thread. Yet one glance was enough to shatter everything. The piercing gaze of a widowed magnate, a man haunted by grief and bound by duty. In that instant, a forbidden story began to unfold, where class, desire, and reputation would collide. A love stitched in secrecy, tested by scandal, and destined to challenge the gilded cages of society. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening to this story from? And what do you love most about period romances? Newport, Rhode Island, summer of 1890. The evening air carried the scent of salt and roses, mingling with the soft clatter of hooves against cobblestone as carriages lined the crescent drive of the Langley estate. Light spilled from tall arched windows, where chandeliers bathed the ballroom in golden firelight, and the strains of a string quartet drifted like perfume into the night. Inside, lace rustled and silk shimmered as society's finest glided through an ocean of marble and crystal. The Vanderbilt soiree had begun. In a narrow chamber near the servants' hallway, far from the sweeping staircase and grand chandeliers, a young woman bent over a length of imported silk, her fingers moving with silent urgency. Harriet Lowell, 26 years old. Seamstress by necessity, artist by nature, worked by lamplight. Her bodice was simple grey cotton, sleeves rolled just enough to reveal wrists pale from lack of sun. Her chestnut brown hair was twisted into a low, practical bun, a few defiant curls escaping to graze her temples. She had been summoned with barely an hour's notice to correct a last-minute disaster. The hem of a gown belonging to Miss Agatha Langley, heir to a fortune built on railroads and speculation. The gown, midnight blue satin layered with French lace, was exquisite, but the hem had torn and panic had struck. It was Harriet they had sent for, just as they always did when appearances teetered on the edge of ruin. She had slipped in through the back with her satchel and no welcome, only the hissed orders of the housekeeper and a quick wave toward the servant's stair. She worked in silence. She always did. Words were a luxury in rooms like these, and hers were best saved for thread and needle. She crouched beside the gown where it hung on a dress form, pinning lace with careful precision, the clock ticking toward the hour of presentation. Her fingers flew, never trembling. She could sew through heartbreak and hunger, and tonight was no different. But it was not only the gown that would be seen that night. Beyond the half-closed door of the chamber, laughter rose and fell like waves. Harriet, driven by habit, resisted the urge to look. She had no place there, not among women who wore diamonds like rainwater and danced beneath painted ceilings. Still, a breath escaped her lips when the music shifted. Something in the melody, in the distant trill of a violin, stirred a feeling she could not name. She glanced up, and in that instant, through the narrow sliver of the door, she saw him. He was not dancing. He was standing still amid a swirl of motion, watching the room as if it were a game he no longer wished to play. Charles Whitmore, the steel magnate whose name alone could open or close doors across 3 states, stood by a marble column, untouched by the frenzy around him. His dark hair was swept back with care, touched at the temples with premature grey. His black evening coat, tailored to perfection, gleamed beneath the gaslight. But it was not his attire that caught Harriet's breath. It was the solitude in his eyes. For a single second, no more, his gaze shifted toward her door. Through that narrow space, across the distance of 2 worlds, their eyes met. She did not look away, neither did he. Her heart stammered. A heat rose in her cheeks, unfamiliar and unwanted. She returned to her stitching quickly, as if the moment could be undone by speed alone. But her hands trembled now. A man like that, a man of wealth, widowed, powerful, untouchable, could not possibly have seen her. Not truly. Yet he had. Charles blinked, unsettled by what he had just witnessed. A woman in grey, no jewels, no fanfare. Yet something in her posture, the turn of her neck, the calm steadiness of her gaze, had pierced through the haze of polite conversation. He had not looked at any woman since his wife's passing. He had not wanted to, but now he could not look away. In the servants' room, Harriet finished the final stitch, bit the thread with practiced ease, and smoothed the hem into place. The gown was ready. She draped it delicately over her arm and stepped into the corridor, where a maid took it from her with a hasty nod. No thanks, no words, just silence. As she turned to leave, her eyes swept once more across the crowd. The music rose. A chandelier above caught the light just so, refracting in icy arcs across polished marble. She saw Charles again, now deep in conversation with the senator's wife, but his gaze lifted, finding hers with impossible precision. Their eyes met once more, and this time the moment stretched. Neither smiled, neither spoke, but something unspoken passed between them, weightless and thunderous all at once. She lowered her eyes first, heart pounding, and walked away. Minutes later, as the music swelled and couples danced, a servant returned to the ballroom with a curious item, a single grey glove, thin, feminine, forgotten. He brought it to Charles, who took it without speaking. That night he held the glove longer than he should have. And in the quiet hours before dawn, as the gilded halls of Newport fell into silence once more, Charles Whitmore found himself thinking not of mergers, nor of legacy, nor of grief, but of the seamstress in grey, and the way her eyes had seen him as no one else ever had. The morning sun filtered gently through the lace curtains of a modest boarding house on Bowen's Wharf, casting dappled light over the worn wooden floor and the narrow cot where Harriet Lowell sat in silence, her sewing basket at her feet. The events of the previous night clung to her skin like the scent of roses that had lingered in the ballroom air, faint, fleeting, and impossible to forget. She had returned late, her hands stiff from the long hours of stitching, and her soul stirred by something she could not name. Not the music, not the opulence, not even the gown she had saved from disgrace. It was a single moment, brief, silent, yet piercing, that had followed her home. A gaze, a pause, and the impossible thought that for a heartbeat she had been seen. But such thoughts were dangerous, and Harriet Lowell, if nothing else, had learned to survive by staying grounded. She forced herself to thread a needle, to focus on the worn hem of a client's petticoat, to push aside the memory of blue eyes that had studied her with quiet intensity. A knock on the door startled her. It was not the landlord. When she opened it, her breath caught at the sight of the man standing in the hallway. He was dressed impeccably, in a dark livery trimmed with silver braid, a leather satchel slung over one arm, his posture impeccable, his tone formal. "Miss Lowell?" he asked, removing his hat with a courteous bow. "I've been sent on behalf of Mr. Charles Whitmore. He wishes to return this to you." The footman reached into his satchel and withdrew a glove, grey cotton, slightly frayed at the seams, unmistakably hers. Harriet took it with unsteady hands, heart beginning to thrum. "I must have dropped it," she murmured, embarrassed, already closing the door. But the footman hesitated. "There is also a message, miss." She blinked. "A message?" He handed her a folded sheet of fine stationery, cream-coloured and embossed with a small silver crest, modest but elegant. She unfolded it with care, her fingertips trembling slightly. The handwriting was precise, male, reserved. "Miss Lowell, I was informed of your skill last night, but no one had mentioned your speed and precision. I have a private collection of garments that once belonged to my late wife. I intend to donate them, but many are in need of careful restoration. If you are available for a private consultation, please send word. With respect, Charles Whitmore." Harriet stared at the letter for a long moment, lips slightly parted, unsure if she had misread. Private consultation. The words echoed in her mind, heavy with significance. She said nothing as the footman awaited her reply. Only when he cleared his throat did she murmur, "Tell Mr. Whitmore I will come tomorrow." Late afternoon. The man bowed again and disappeared down the narrow stairs, his boots echoing softly in the silence he left behind. Harriet closed the door slowly, pressing her back against it, the letter clutched to her chest. She had never received a note like that in her life. Later that day, as the sun dipped westward and the scent of sea brine crept in through the shutters, Maggie O'Connell burst into the room with her usual fire. "You should have seen the ruffles on the Peterson girl's tea dress today. Absolutely sinful. Looked like a doily had thrown up on her skirt," she said, tossing her sewing bag onto the table. But the moment her eyes fell on Harriet's flushed face and the envelope resting beside the glove on the table, she stopped cold. "What is that?" Harriet didn't speak. Maggie picked up the note, read it quickly, and gasped. "Charles Whitmore," she whispered, eyes wide. "The Charles Whitmore, the widower, the Steel King of Manhattan, he sent this?" Harriet nodded once, slowly. Maggie collapsed into a chair, fanning herself with the envelope. "Sweet Lord in heaven, Hattie, you stared at him too long, didn't you?" "I did no such thing." "You did, or he stared at you. Oh, this is bad." "Why is it bad?" Harriet asked, trying to mask her anxiety with a weak smile. "Because men like him don't call on women like us unless they want something they shouldn't ask for." Maggie stood, suddenly serious. "Don't go, Harriet." But Harriet's gaze drifted to the glove. "I gave my word." The following afternoon arrived faster than she expected. She dressed with care, though she chose nothing extravagant, only her cleanest blouse, pale ivory, with a simple lace collar, and her grey skirt with the least amount of wear at the hem. She tied her hair in its usual low bun, leaving 2 soft curls loose at her temples without quite knowing why. A shawl draped over her shoulders, a small satchel in her hand, and she was ready. The Whitmore residence sat at the edge of the cliffs, a grand house of red brick and iron-trimmed balconies, elegant but not ostentatious. It felt private, guarded, like the man who lived inside. She was led through the servants' entrance, but no one treated her as lesser. The butler addressed her by name. The parlor into which she was shown was warm, lined with books and heavy drapes, the scent of old leather and roses faint in the air. She waited in silence until the door opened, and there he was. Charles Whitmore entered without preamble, dressed in a charcoal waistcoat and black trousers, his collar unbuttoned at the throat, just enough to suggest he had shed formality for comfort. He was not the man she had seen in the ballroom. He looked tired, unguarded, older, but somehow more human. "Miss Lowell," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." She stood, hands clasped tightly before her. "You asked for a consultation." "I did." He motioned toward a collection of trunks near the window. "They were my wife's," he said, his voice lower now, almost hesitant. "I have held on to them longer than I should have." Harriet stepped closer. He lifted the lid of one trunk, revealing silk, brocade, lace, the belongings of a woman now gone. "They deserve a second life," he said. "And you want them preserved before they are given away?" He nodded. "Yes." They said nothing for a moment. Harriet reached into the trunk, her fingers brushing the fabric. The gowns were exquisite, but aged. She lifted one, examining its seams. "I can restore most of them," she said softly. He did not reply. His eyes were on her hands. The silence grew charged, not uncomfortable but deep, as if something unsaid hovered between them. Harriet glanced up. He was watching her again, not with desire, not with pity, but with a kind of reverent curiosity, as though she were a puzzle he had just begun to solve. "You remind me of her," he said at last. Harriet's breath caught. "Not in appearance," he added, "but in how carefully you move, how you observe everything. She was always quiet, my wife. People mistook that for weakness, but I never did." Harriet lowered her gaze. "And do you believe I am weak?" "No," he answered, his voice almost a whisper. "I think you are the first person in a long time who has looked at me without asking for anything." The words struck deeper than she expected. She turned back to the gowns, needing the comfort of work, of thread and fabric, but her hands betrayed her, just slightly, a tremble. He saw it and said nothing. That afternoon, Harriet left the Whitmore residence with 3 gowns in her satchel and a storm inside her chest. He had not touched her, had barely stood near her. Yet somehow, his gaze had left a mark no hand could trace, and as she stepped out into the fading light of Newport's summer day, the wind catching the edge of her shawl, she understood something with aching clarity. This commission would be unlike any she had taken before. The days in Newport passed with the heavy languor of midsummer. The gardens bloomed in riotous colour beneath the sun, and the sea whispered secrets to the cliffs that held the mansions upright like old sentinels. Yet within the red brick facade of the Whitmore estate, time began to move differently, for both Harriet Lowell and the man who had summoned her into his silence. Every Thursday afternoon, as the clock neared 4, Harriet would arrive at the Whitmore residence by the servants' entrance. The butler no longer blinked when she was announced, and the maids had learned not to stare. Her steps echoed softly on polished floors as she made her way to the western parlor, where the light filtered through velvet drapes and landed on the dust-covered trunks that waited by the windows. Each trunk held the garments of a life no longer lived. And each visit, Harriet would find Charles Whitmore already there, never seated, never idle, always standing with his hands behind his back, as if the very air required discipline. Yet each time she entered, he would turn toward her with that same unreadable expression, not warm, not cold, but aware. It was awareness that made her uneasy. That, and the quiet. Their conversations, when they happened, were low and without flourish. He never asked personal questions, and yet his eyes followed her hands with an intensity that made her chest tighten. She would kneel beside a trunk, gently removing gowns folded in yellowed tissue, and he would sometimes kneel as well, across from her, wordless, present. He observed the way she examined seams and lifted lace. He watched the way she frowned when she found a moth-eaten edge or a frayed cuff. And she, though she tried not to, became acutely aware of his presence in the room. She noticed the way his breath caught when she lifted one particular ivory gown with a beaded bodice, or how his jaw tensed at the sight of the lavender dress that still carried a faint scent of violets. "She wore that one," he said one afternoon, his voice rough from disuse, "to our anniversary dinner, 2 months before she fell ill." Harriet froze for just a moment, the gown draped over her hands. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Charles looked away. It was a long time ago, but the pause in his voice said otherwise. She did not press him. Instead, she folded the gown gently and placed it atop the others, as if it were still meant to be worn. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was sacred, and she understood then that these sessions were not about garments at all. They were about memory and grief, and perhaps the fragile possibility of breathing again. By the 4th week, the whispers had begun. They floated through parlors like perfume, sweet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. Lavinia Rutherford, whose sapphire blue eyes never missed a detail, was the first to speak her suspicions aloud at a luncheon hosted by the Bellevue Club. "I've heard," she said casually, stirring her tea with deliberate grace, "that Mr. Whitmore has taken quite a personal interest in a seamstress, a young one at that." The other women gasped in unison, their fans fluttering like startled doves. "He invites her into the house," Lavinia continued, voice a dagger wrapped in silk, "alone, repeatedly, and she leaves with parcels in her hands. Is it fabric or favours?" The implication was clear. Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore, seated at the head of the table, did not flinch. Her spine remained straight, her teacup poised, but her eyes turned to stone. "That girl," she said, her voice low and perfectly enunciated, "is not our kind, and my son would do well to remember the difference." That evening, as the shadows deepened in the Whitmore estate, Harriet sat in the western parlour, surrounded by gowns she was mending. The lamps glowed with a warm hush, casting golden halos over velvet and lace. Her fingers moved steadily, threading pearls onto a dulled bodice, but her mind was elsewhere. She had felt it. The shift. The way the footman had glanced at her today, not rudely, but with recognition. The way one of the housemaids had lingered near the parlor longer than usual, pretending to polish the mirror. And most of all, the way Charles had looked at her, not like a man indulging a passing curiosity, but like a man torn between duty and desire. He entered then, quietly, carrying a leather-bound portfolio. He placed it gently on the table beside her and opened it without a word. Inside were sketches, gown silhouettes, patterns, some half-finished, others more refined. "My wife designed these," he said. Harriet looked up, startled. "She was a dressmaker." "She never sold her work," he replied, "but she had an eye for beauty. She found joy in it. She used to say a gown could change the way a woman walked into a room." Harriet reached out and touched one of the pages with reverence. She was right. Charles sat across from her for the first time, not beside the window, not pacing near the fireplace. Across, close. "Do you ever design for yourself, Miss Lowell?" he asked. Harriet smiled faintly, her hands still on the page. "I've never had the time, or the fabric, or the occasion. I could change that." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than the silence that followed. Harriet lifted her eyes to his. "And why would you do that, Mr. Whitmore?" He didn't answer right away. His gaze moved over her face, resting on her mouth for a second too long, then returning to her eyes. "Because I find that I want to," he said at last, "and I do not understand it, but I do." Harriet rose slowly, her heart pounding against her ribs. She could feel the heat rising in her neck, the warning bell of something dangerous and undeniable. She walked to the window, drawing the curtain back slightly to let in the last pink trace of the sunset. "You're grieving, sir," she said, her voice composed but quiet. "And people who grieve often reach for warmth they cannot explain. That is all this is." Behind her Charles stood, but did not move closer. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps I'm only beginning to understand what I never dared to want." She turned then, slowly, her hand still gripping the velvet drape. Their eyes met, and in that gaze, filled with restraint, grief, and the stirrings of something too fragile to name, Harriet saw the truth, not just of him, but of herself. She would not survive this untouched, and she was no longer certain she wanted to. That evening, she left without taking the portfolio. Charles watched her go, his fingers still on the spine of the book, and in the silence she left behind, the air trembled with something unfinished. The morning sky over Newport unfurled like pale silk, threaded with gold and whispers of sea mist. Beneath it, the grandest of the summer homes opened their gates to an exclusive gathering of names carved into the foundation of old wealth. It was not a ball, nor a masquerade, nor even a soiree, but a charity luncheon, that most delicate of battlegrounds where society's most powerful women paraded virtue in silk gloves and crushed dreams with a raised brow. The invitation had come 2 days earlier, folded in parchment scented faintly with lavender and signed in the unmistakable pen of Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore. The message had arrived at Harriet's modest doorstep with no explanation, only an address, a date, and the chilling formality of being summoned. At first, Harriet had believed it a mistake, but then came the second note, this one brief, written by Charles himself. "You need not come, but if you do, walk in, as you always have, on your own terms." She had stared at those words long after the ink dried. Now, dressed in her finest blouse, cream with delicate lace trim, and a dove-grey skirt with careful mending along the hem, Harriet stood at the base of the Whitmore garden terrace, staring up at the estate that loomed like a monument to everything she was not. Her hair was swept into its usual low chignon, though she had taken time to polish her boots until they gleamed. A borrowed hat, modest but tasteful, sat atop her head. She wore no jewellery, save for the silver thimble still tucked into her sewing satchel, now hidden under her cloak. She entered alone. The luncheon had already begun. Dozens of ladies stood in arched formations beneath a silk canopy draped across the lawn. Parasols turned like the petals of rare flowers. Waiters moved silently between marble tables adorned with crystal bowls of sugared fruit and violet cordials. The orchestra played something cheerful and distant, like laughter heard behind closed doors. Harriet's entrance did not go unnoticed. Eyes turned. Conversations paused. Some women stared directly, assessing her like an irregular thread in a bolt of fine fabric. Others turned their shoulders in practiced dismissal. The air did not grow hostile. It remained pleasantly brutal, coated in civility and laced with judgment. She kept walking. And then she saw Lavinia Rutherford, dressed in a high-necked gown of pale lilac silk with a row of pearl buttons that shimmered in the sun. Lavinia stood beside Adelaide Whitmore, as if the two had been sculpted from the same block of frost. Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Well," she said, voice smooth as satin. "You've arrived." Harriet inclined her head. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said quietly. "Miss Rutherford." Adelaide's gaze was unreadable. "We are pleased to have you," she replied without warmth. "You may join the second table." The second table, where widows, aging debutantes and women without titles were strategically placed. Harriet smiled politely, nodded again, and took her place. She said little during the meal. She did not reach for the wine. She listened, observed, endured. Comments floated like perfume. "She sews beautifully, I hear. Such delicate work. Yes, even the roughest hands can shape lace if taught early. And she's quite striking in a plain way, wouldn't you say?" Harriet's hands remained folded in her lap. When dessert was served, Lavinia rose and glided toward her with an effortless grace. She stopped just beside Harriet's chair and leaned in, lowering her voice as though offering something charitable. "I do hope you're enjoying yourself, Miss Lowell. I know this must feel overwhelming." Harriet met her eyes without flinching. "The air is thinner than I'm used to," she said calmly, "but I find it refreshing." Lavinia blinked. For the briefest moment, her expression faltered, but only just. "Careful," she whispered with a smile. "You wouldn't want to appear clever. That makes them nervous." Harriet didn't answer. She didn't need to. From the edge of the garden, beneath the shadow of a stone archway, Charles watched. He had not been expected. Not by his mother, not by Lavinia, and certainly not by the gathering of women who still whispered his name in drawing rooms across the coast. But he stood there, arms folded, silent, and he saw everything. That evening, the ballroom of the Whitmore house was silent, lit only by the flicker of gas lamps reflected in the towering mirrors that lined the far wall. The day's warmth had faded into the sea, and the breeze carried in through the terrace doors smelled faintly of salt and old pine. Harriet stood near the grand piano, her hands resting on its polished surface, though she did not play. Charles entered quietly, not yet announced by the soft creak of the door, and paused when he saw her. She wore the same dove-grey skirt, but now without her hat, and her hair had loosened from its pins, softening her silhouette. She looked nothing like the women who had filled the garden that afternoon. She looked real. "I heard what they said to you," he said finally. Harriet turned, her expression unreadable. "You were not meant to," she replied. "I should have intervened." "No," she said, her voice low. "You should not have had to." He stepped closer, each footfall measured, deliberate. The silence between them stretched like silk pulled taut across a frame. "You were extraordinary," he said, "not for enduring them, but for refusing to shrink." Harriet shook her head, almost smiled. "That's easy to say in private." He took another step, and now he stood barely a breath away. His hand reached toward her, but stopped just short of her cheek. "Then let me say it publicly," he said, his voice thick with something he could no longer disguise. "Let me give them something to whisper about." For a suspended heartbeat, the world narrowed to that space between his hand and her skin. Her breath caught, but then she turned her face away. "I can't," she said softly. "Why?" "Because I don't know what this is," she whispered. "And I won't be the salve for your mourning." Charles flinched as if struck. "I'm not a memory, Mr. Whitmore," she said, stepping back, "and I won't be treated like one." He said nothing, only watched her as she crossed the room, her silhouette framed in the arched doorway, and as the light faded from the ballroom's mirrors, he realized that no matter how grand the cage, a woman like Harriet would never let herself be gilded. The leaves of early autumn had begun to drift through the cobbled streets of Newport, gilding the city in fleeting gold. Mornings were now touched by a crispness that lingered on the fingertips and crept into the folds of shawls and scarves. Carriages moved more quickly, coats were buttoned higher, and the laughter from garden parties gave way to the rustle of fallen leaves and the deeper silence of approaching winter. Inside the Whitmore estate, the velvet drapes remained drawn longer, and the hearths were lit earlier in the day. But despite the warm glow of fire and the scent of cinnamon in the air, something colder had begun to settle in the heart of the house. Charles Whitmore had become a man of shadows again. It began gradually: missed appointments, messages delayed, brief letters scrawled by a secretary rather than in his own hand. He no longer stood in the parlor when Harriet arrived. The trunks remained untouched. The gowns gathered dust again. Harriet, once welcomed with a silent glance and the weight of an unspoken bond, now found only silence waiting for her. She told herself it was nothing, that men like him, powerful, burdened, constantly scrutinized, had every right to retreat behind their obligations. But the more she repeated it, the more hollow the words became. One Thursday afternoon, as she waited in the parlor with her hands clasped tightly on her lap, the butler entered with a soft bow. "Mr. Whitmore sends his regrets, Miss Lowell. A business matter requires his attention. He asks that you leave the gowns in the vestibule." Harriet nodded, her face calm, but her heart curled inward, as if winter had arrived early in her chest. She stepped into the hallway, passing the mirror by the staircase. For a moment she paused. She looked older in that reflection, more tired. The fire in her eyes, once steady, now flickered with the ache of uncertainty. When she returned to her boarding house that evening, Maggie was waiting with a kettle already boiling and an expression that gave no room for lies. "He's pulling away," Maggie said, pouring the tea and sliding a cup across the table. Harriet didn't answer. "Don't pretend he's not," Maggie continued, folding her arms, "and don't pretend it doesn't matter to you." "It's not that simple," Harriet said softly. "Oh, it is," Maggie countered, her voice fierce with loyalty. "He's a Whitmore, Harriet. He lives behind gates guarded by names you and I will never be allowed to speak freely. You think he can just invite you into that world without cost? I didn't ask to be invited, but you walked through the door all the same." Harriet's silence was the only confession she could offer. Maggie reached across the table and touched her hand gently. "Promise me you won't let him tear you down in the same quiet way he built you up. That's how these men work. They make you feel seen, and then they disappear. And you're left wondering if it was all a dream." Harriet blinked hard. It didn't feel like a dream. Maybe that's what makes it worse. The next morning, the city was overcast. Clouds rolled over the harbor, heavy and low, like unspoken truths pressing down on the rooftops. Harriet made her way to a small dressmaker's shop near Thames Street, delivering a set of cuffs she had embroidered for a client. She moved quietly through the market, pausing at the grocer's for thread, when a voice stopped her cold. "Miss Lowell, is it?" She turned. A man stood there, well-dressed, with dark hair and a pointed smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was too polished for the street, his coat too finely tailored, his boots too recently shined. "I'm sorry," Harriet said. "Have we met?" "Not formally," he replied, offering a brief bow. "Burton Hawthorne. I've heard your name whispered in some very elegant circles." Harriet straightened. "What circles?" "The kind where it matters who a man speaks to when he thinks no one is watching." She narrowed her gaze. "Is there something you need, Mr. Hawthorne?" He smiled again, this time more slowly. "Just a conversation. About your talents and your access." Harriet's stomach turned. "I have no idea what you're implying." "I think you do," he said smoothly. You spend time in the Whitmore estate. You see things, hear things, perhaps things Mr. Whitmore doesn't realize are valuable. I'm a seamstress, Harriet said sharply, not a spy. But you could be a very well-paid one, he said, reaching into his pocket and sliding a small envelope onto the table beside her. Think about it. Discretion has a price, and I'm willing to pay. She stared at the envelope for a long moment. Then, without touching it, she picked it up and placed it gently in the nearby basket of discarded linens. I won't be bought, she said coldly. Everyone has a price, he replied, not unkindly. Then you've underestimated me. Harriet turned and walked away, her heart hammering, her hands trembling, not from fear but from fury. The next day, the whispers returned. Not the subtle ones of silk-clad ladies, but sharper, crueler rumours passed between footmen and chambermaids, that the seamstress had been seen in the study, that she had accepted gifts, that Mr. Whitmore was not himself, that she had her own reasons for spending so many quiet afternoons in that parlour. When Harriet arrived at the estate the following week, the air was different, colder. She was escorted not to the western parlour, but to a side sitting room she had never seen before. It was smaller, less ornate. No music played, the fireplace had not been lit. Charles entered after several minutes, his coat still dusted with the chill of the morning. He looked as though he had not slept. His eyes were rimmed with something that might have been weariness or wariness. Harriet rose to greet him, but he did not offer his hand. You've been seen speaking to Burton Hawthorne, he said. She blinked. Briefly. He approached me in the street. Oh, he claims you took something from him. Harriet felt the sting before she could brace herself. I didn't, she said. He offered me money. I refused. Then why is your name in his letters? Charles asked, his voice too even. Because he's trying to destroy you, she replied, her voice breaking, and you're letting him. He turned away, jaw clenched. I should have known, she whispered, barely able to say the words, that this, whatever it was, would turn into something I had to defend. Charles turned back to her, something wounded in his expression. Harriet, no, she said, her voice firmer now. You invited me into your silence, into your world, and now you question me like a stranger. He reached out then, almost in desperation, but she stepped back. I know what this is, she said. It's a hand on a railing, Charles. Just enough to steady yourself, but not enough to hold. He said nothing, and the silence between them, once sacred, now felt like a wall. That afternoon, as Harriet descended the Whitmore staircase for what she feared might be the final time, the wind outside cut sharper than ever before, and though her hands were empty, her heart carried the weight of 100 unsaid things. Snow had begun to fall that afternoon, soft as whispers, blanketing Newport in a hush that made even the grandest mansions seem momentarily tender. But inside the Whitmore estate, the air pulsed with anticipation. Footmen moved swiftly, their boots muffled by thick carpets, while chandeliers were polished to a glimmering brilliance, and candles were lit in candelabra tall as men. It was to be the most lavish event of the season, a winter masquerade, conceived to celebrate the upcoming merger between the Whitmore Holdings and a Southern rail empire. The guest list included senators, industrialists, foreign dignitaries, and the women who had woven themselves into their shadows with jewels, secrets, and ambition. And at the center of it all stood Lavinia Rutherford, draped in crimson silk and a rubied choker that shimmered like blood under candlelight. Her gown clung to her like a second skin, flaring behind her in bold, predatory folds. Her mask, gold and edged in feathers, was not meant to hide, but to heighten. Tonight, she believed, the world would see her as what she was destined to be, the future Mrs. Charles Whitmore. Servants whispered of a ring locked away in his study, of a speech prepared, of a union that would blend power with beauty, wealth with old name. But Charles Whitmore was not thinking of proposals. He stood at the top of the grand staircase, dressed in black and ivory, his own mask simple, austere, as if he wished to disappear. His eyes searched the ballroom not for opportunity nor for profit, but for something unnamed, something missing. Harriet Lowell did not intend to attend the ball. She had been working late in her boarding room, finishing an urgent alteration on a velvet waistcoat intended for a senator's son, when the messenger arrived. The note was from Mrs. Whitmore's maid, begging for a last-minute correction to a damaged hem, Lavinia's hem. Harriet hesitated, but professionalism prevailed. With her satchel over her arm and her fingers chilled from the walk, she arrived through the back entrance of the estate, as she always had, but the servant who met her this time was breathless, flustered. "They need you upstairs," he said. "She's furious." Harriet climbed quickly, navigating corridors now transformed by garlands of holly and gold ribbon. But when she reached the room where the gown awaited her, she found the door ajar and silence within. The room was empty. Only the gown remained, draped across a chaise. Its damage was minor, a torn seam, nothing more. But beside it, laid carefully across the bed, was another dress. This one was cobalt blue, trimmed with antique lace and sewn with mother-of-pearl beads. It shimmered like moonlight on midnight water. A note sat beside it. "You may choose not to wear it, but if you do, you are no longer invisible." There was no signature, only the weight of decision. Harriet stared at the dress for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly she unpinned her hair. In the ballroom, no one recognized her at first. The mask she wore was soft ivory, trimmed with satin, and it concealed enough to provoke questions. Her hair was down for the first time in public, curling over her shoulders like dark honey. The dress fit as though it had waited its whole life for her, and Charles saw her the moment she entered. He did not move, did not speak. His chest tightened as if his lungs had forgotten how to draw air. He crossed the ballroom in silence, weaving through dancers like a man moving through fog. He did not stop until he stood before her. Neither spoke. He extended his gloved hand. She placed hers atop it, and they danced. The waltz was slow, haunting. The world blurred around them. Harriet's pulse thundered in her ears, but her steps did not falter. Charles held her as if afraid to grip too tightly, afraid she might vanish if touched without reverence. He did not know her name, not in that moment, and she did not know his. They were strangers in masks, wrapped in the illusion of anonymity. And yet everything between them was real. Each turn brought them closer. Each breath deepened the silence between words. And when the final note trembled into stillness, he leaned in. Not hastily, not hungrily, but with aching restraint, his lips brushing just above the corner of hers, a kiss that was not a kiss, a promise made in air. Her eyes fluttered shut, and in that fragile instant she let herself believe. But the moment shattered like glass underfoot. A gasp rippled through the room. Lavinia stood at the edge of the dance floor, her mask gone, her eyes bright with fury. Behind her, several society matrons turned their heads with horror and delight. "She's the seamstress," Lavinia's voice rang out. "She stitches hems and men's undergarments. She doesn't belong here." The music stopped. The room fell to silence. Harriet felt the weight of 100 eyes, the shame, the judgment, the cold certainty that she had crossed a line never meant for her feet. Charles stepped forward, but Harriet raised her chin. She would not let him speak, not for her. She turned, her skirts sweeping the floor like a final curtain, and walked from the ballroom without a word. She did not run, she did not cry. Only when she reached the back hallway, where the air smelled of wax and wood smoke, did her hands begin to tremble. She removed the mask slowly, and with it every illusion she had allowed herself to believe. That night, Charles stood in the ballroom long after the last guest had gone. Lavinia had left in a storm of carriage wheels and indignation. Adelaide had vanished behind closed doors, but Charles remained, staring at the doors through which Harriet had disappeared. He held the ivory mask she had worn in his hands, and he did not know how to breathe without her. The snowfall in Newport had thickened in the days following the masquerade. What had once been a delicate dusting had now become a silent siege, blanketing the rooftops, muffling the streets, and sealing the city in a hush that mirrored the silence left in the wake of Harriet Lowell's departure from the Whitmore estate. Yet the quiet outside bore little resemblance to the noise inside society's drawing rooms. The scandal, once sparked, had spread like a fire through satin. Whispers, once soft as silk, now hissed like serpents behind gloves and behind fans. She danced with him, masked, of course. She intended it. A seamstress. And he kissed her? It was all planned. Seduction under disguise. Manipulation. He was never the same after his wife died. They always say grief makes men vulnerable. Every woman who had once praised Harriet's craftsmanship now refused to speak her name aloud. Clients cancelled fittings. Invitations vanished. Letters went unanswered. The seamstress who had once passed quietly through the city's grandest corridors was now an object of curiosity, pity, and disdain, but never compassion. At the heart of the tempest stood Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore, still as marble, cold as a cathedral in winter. She had borne many storms in her lifetime, but none so threatening to her legacy. Her voice did not rise when she summoned her son to the conservatory. Her anger did not flame. It froze. "She has stained the Whitmore name," she said, sipping her tea with steady hands. "She used your mourning, Charles. She preyed upon it with soft hands and quiet eyes." "She didn't," Charles said hoarsely. "You don't know her." "I know her kind," Adelaide answered, not lifting her gaze. "They do not ask for gold. They ask for time, for presence, for meaning, and they strip you of it all until there is nothing left." Charles stood, pacing toward the frosted window. Snow slid slowly down the glass, melting where it met the warmth inside. He spoke with restraint, but tension tightened every word. "She never asked for anything, which is why she was more dangerous than the rest." Adelaide's gaze sharpened. "You are my son," she said, "but you are also a Whitmore, and the Whitmore fortune is not yours to scatter over a seamstress like breadcrumbs." When he didn't respond, she set her teacup down with delicate finality. "If you insist on defending her, Charles, you will no longer be the heir to this house. The board has made that clear. They speak of scandal, of erratic behavior, of romantic weakness. Do not make me choose between protecting our name and protecting you." He did not speak. He could not. The words would not form in his throat, though his chest screamed with them. And by the time he left the room, the silence he carried with him had already become a verdict. Harriet, meanwhile, had returned to Providence under the cover of early morning light, her satchel tucked tightly under her arm, her heart in pieces she refused to count. She had taken no carriage, no escort, only a single train ride through fogged windows and frozen fields. The gown she had worn, the blue one, so beautiful it had felt like a dream, had been left folded on the edge of the dressing-room chair, its bodice untouched, its soul emptied. In Providence, the boarding-house welcomed her with a familiarity she had not realized she missed. The creak of the stairs, the worn edge of the banister, the way Maggie threw open the door before she even knocked. "My God, Hattie," Maggie breathed, pulling her into a fierce embrace. "What did they do to you?" Harriet didn't speak. Not at first. She simply stood in the center of the small room, where sunlight poured in through lace curtains and dust floated like memories. Then slowly her knees gave way and she sank to the floor. Not from weakness, from the unbearable weight of what had almost been. She told Maggie everything. Not in a rush, not in fury, but in the still, raw voice of someone recounting a story she could hardly believe was her own. Maggie listened. And when the tears came, silent, stubborn, choking, she held Harriet the way sisters hold each other when no words will do. "I should never have gone," Harriet whispered. "I should have known I wasn't meant for that world." "No," Maggie said, brushing the hair from her friend's face. "You were meant for more than their world." "But he didn't defend me," Maggie exhaled. "Then he wasn't worth the parts of you he took." For the next week, Harriet did not sew. She unpacked her needles, but did not touch them. She ran her fingers over thread spools, as if they were relics from a life she no longer recognized. She moved like someone half awake, until one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Providence, casting the windows in honeyed light, she heard the sound of carriage wheels on cobblestone. She did not go to the window. She did not need to. She knew he would not come. In Newport, Charles Whitmore sat alone in the drawing room that had once belonged to his late wife. The fire had long gone out. The curtains remained drawn, the room untouched. Only the portrait remained. Painted in soft oils, her face hovered in the shadows, forever young, forever distant. He stared at it for what felt like hours, until the weight of her eyes became unbearable. "She's gone," he said aloud. Not to the portrait, not to the room, but to the hollow ache in his chest. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt the grief he had refused to name shift beneath the surface, making space for another kind of sorrow. The kind one feels not for the dead, but for the living who chose to walk away. Winter melted into spring with a kind of quiet cruelty. The snow receded from the cobblestones, revealing cracks that had been hidden beneath the frost. Trees began to bud along the avenues of Newport and Providence, but the blossoms came late that year, as though the world itself hesitated to bloom. In Providence, Harriet Lowell moved with quiet purpose through the narrow aisles of her small dress shop, her steps deliberate, her voice soft but steady. The shop, nestled on a quieter side of Benefit Street, had once been a neglected storefront, with faded shutters and warped floors. Now it smelled of lavender and starch, and the front window displayed delicate gowns made with precision and heart. Her hands, once calloused from work done in secret, now created with dignity. She was no longer invisible, and yet she had never felt so hollow. Months had passed since she had left Newport. The shame had receded into a dull ache, no longer raw, but still present. The humiliation, the whispers, the cruel glances, they had faded like a fever, but the memory of his silence lingered. That silence had spoken more than any words might have. She no longer said his name aloud. Maggie visited often, bringing tea and news, refusing to allow Harriet to disappear entirely into her stitches. One morning, she entered with a swirl of spring wind and a red ribbon tangled in her curls. "You'll never guess," she said, plopping into a chair by the window. "Lavinia Rutherford has gone to Paris. They say she's engaged to a count, a real one, with a limp and a title." Harriet smiled faintly. "Good for her." Maggie narrowed her eyes. "You could pretend to sound more satisfied." "I'm not angry at her." "You should be." Harriet didn't answer. She moved to the back table, adjusting the bodice of a client's gown. "She didn't betray me," Harriet said at last. "He did." The words fell gently, but they carried the full weight of truth. Maggie rose and crossed the room, placing a hand on her friend's shoulder. "You've built something here," she whispered. "Something no one gave you. Not a man, not a name, just you." Harriet turned and smiled, truly this time, but her eyes betrayed her. There were still things unsaid, questions unanswered, threads she had never dared to pull. Later that same week, a letter arrived. It came in a simple cream envelope, unmarked, with no return address. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable, elegant, slanted, full of restraint. Harriet froze when she saw it. She took it to her room, closing the door behind her as if locking away the air. She held it in her hands for a long time, tracing the folds, the weight of the paper. She could smell faint ink and something more subtle, sandalwood perhaps, or cedar, something familiar. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at it. The seal had been broken already. Maggie had likely opened it before placing it in her hands. Still, the contents remained folded. She could have read it. She almost did. But something inside her refused. She reached for the small iron dish on the windowsill, the one she used for pinheads and spent thread, and instead filled it with ash and match. The The flame caught quickly, the edges curled, blackened, and collapsed into dust. She never read a word, but the smoke lingered for hours. In Newport, Charles Whitmore sat in the study where he no longer found peace. The fire burned low, casting long shadows on the hardwood floors. Piles of correspondence lay unanswered on his desk. Financial ledgers, contracts, urgent telegrams, they all blurred together. His empire, once a machine of unbreakable steel and profit, had begun to stagger. Deals fell through, shipments delayed, stockholders grew impatient, rumors surfaced of instability, of neglect. His factories ran slower now, stretched thin by unrest and lack of oversight. And in the silence between responsibilities, his thoughts always returned to her. He remembered the way she had stood beneath the ballroom chandelier, her eyes meeting his across a sea of masks. The strength in her voice when she had refused to be pitied. The softness of her hands. Capable hands, confident hands, now forever out of reach. He had sent the letter not to ask forgiveness, but to confess. He had written it in the early morning hours, long before the sun rose, when guilt had overtaken sleep and the walls of the estate felt more like prison than home. He had folded it carefully, sealing it without signing his name. He hadn't needed to, she would know. But no reply came. The silence she returned was absolute. One evening in late spring, the news broke. There had been an accident at the Whitmore factory on the north end of the city, a boiler malfunction, flames, no deaths but several injured. Workers protested unsafe conditions. Journalists published scathing reports. And though Charles had once been respected, even feared, he was now whispered about in boardrooms and parlors alike. Providence was not far from Newport. News travelled quickly. Maggie burst through Harriet's shop door the next morning, clutching a folded newspaper. "You need to read this," she said breathlessly. Harriet took it reluctantly, scanning the article. The factory name, the damage, the injured men. Her hand trembled. "He was always kind to his workers," she murmured. "He built housing for them, paid them through the winters." "That was before," Maggie said. "This is now." Harriet looked out the window. The streets were quiet, touched with the stillness of a town between seasons. The world outside her shop moved on as if nothing had changed. But inside her chest, something stirred. She remembered the man behind the wealth, the one who had sat beside trunks of lace, silent and grieving. The one who had looked at her like she was the first thing he had seen clearly in years. She had buried him behind betrayal, yes. But now, compassion returned. Slow, reluctant, but real. She did not speak. She simply reached for her shawl and stepped outside. The breeze that met her was neither warm nor cold. It was uncertain, just like her. The air in Newport had changed. Spring had taken hold of the coastline with a firm, relentless hand, coaxing green buds from brittle branches and scattering the scent of sea salt and hyacinth through the waking streets. But within the city's social and political circles, the season had brought little softness. The fire at the Whitmore factory had lit more than steel and timber. It had ignited whispers, accusations, and unrest. Newspaper headlines questioned worker safety, management negligence, and the crumbling of an empire once thought indestructible. And at the center of it all stood Charles Whitmore, a man once untouchable, now vulnerable before public opinion. And Harriet Lowell heard it all from Providence. Clients spoke of the accident in quiet tones as she adjusted hems and took measurements. Maggie read aloud from the papers at the breakfast table, her voice laced with barely concealed fury. The city buzzed with speculation, but it wasn't until one particular headline reached Harriet's eyes that her hands stilled over a bolt of fabric. "Former employees demand inquiry. Whitmore factories under fire." She stared at the words for a long time, her heart beating with a strange, painful rhythm, not for the factory, not for the empire, but for the man she had once seen sitting in a dim parlor, surrounded by the faded gowns of a wife lost too soon. his silence louder than any grief she had ever known. She had tried to forget him, had burned the letter, had built something new from the ashes of her own shame. But still, when she closed her eyes, she could see the way he looked at her. On the staircase, in the ballroom, in the moment before everything collapsed. She remembered his hands, his restraint, his loneliness, and she remembered what he had never said. So when the workers' hearing was scheduled to take place at the courthouse in Newport, she made a quiet decision. Not for romance, not for forgiveness, but for truth. The courtroom stood at the edge of the civic district, a domed building of marble and iron, its columns stained by decades of storms and verdicts. The steps leading up to it were crowded. Reporters, activists, passers-by drawn by the spectacle of a fallen giant. Harriet arrived alone. She wore no ribbons, no fashionable bonnet. Her dress was the same pale blue muslin she wore for market deliveries, its cuffs freshly mended. Her shoes bore scuffs from the cobblestone streets, and in her gloved hands she carried only a folded piece of paper and a heart steadied by resolve. Inside, the gallery was nearly full. Members of the press leaned forward with pens ready. Industrial board members murmured behind pocket watches and spectacles. Charles sat near the front, flanked by legal counsel and men in dark coats with familiar surnames. His profile was composed, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. He did not know she was there, not until her name was called. "Miss Harriet Lowell," said the clerk. The murmurs began instantly. She rose and walked slowly toward the witness chair, the hem of her dress whispering across the polished floor. Eyes followed her. Judgment weighed heavily in the air, but she kept her gaze forward. When she reached the stand, she turned not to the board, but to the crowd. "I am not a factory worker," she began, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I am a seamstress. I have never set foot inside the Whitmore plant on North Hill. I cannot testify to boilers or wages or ledgers, but I can tell you what I have seen." She paused, eyes flicking to Charles, just for a breath. "I have seen a man grieve behind locked doors, not for pity but in silence. I have seen a man employ artisans and pay them not with delay, but with dignity. I have watched him help families bury their dead and offer housing to those who had none. These are not things written into contracts. These are not things that make headlines." A hush fell over the room. "I am not defending a corporation," she continued. "I am not here to protect a name. But if the question before you is whether Charles Whitmore is a man who cares for those under his responsibility, then yes, I believe he does." The silence that followed her final words was absolute. Even the pens stopped. Even the whispers held their breath. Harriet stepped down, her head held high, and walked past the row where Charles sat without turning toward him. She left the courthouse as she had arrived, alone, unescorted, and unmoved by spectacle. But she did not get far. Later that afternoon, as the sky turned lavender above the spires of the old city and the gulls cried overhead, Harriet found herself wandering along the edge of Brenton Point. The wind pulled at her shawl, and the scent of the sea wrapped around her like a memory. She walked slowly, her thoughts caught in a storm she could no longer contain. When the sound of footsteps behind her reached her ears, she did not turn, not until she heard his voice. "Harriet." She turned. Charles stood a few paces away, his coat unbuttoned, hair tousled by the wind. He looked older than she remembered, more tired, more real, but his eyes had not changed. They still searched her as if he feared she might vanish again. "I didn't expect you to come," he said. "I didn't come for you," she answered, though her voice trembled. "I know." They stood in silence as the wind stirred the long grasses, and the waves crashed against the rocks below. He stepped closer, just enough for her to feel the warmth of his presence. "I've stepped away," he said, "from the merger, from the board, from the inheritance, from every chain they used to hold me in place." Harriet said nothing. He swallowed hard. "I didn't write that letter to ask for your forgiveness. I wrote it because not saying it felt worse than being refused." She looked at him, really looked. What did it say? That I was wrong. He took another step. He did not reach for her. He did not beg. I should have spoken when they accused you. I should have defended you not with silence but with truth. I let my fear weigh more than my heart, and I've paid for it in every moment since. The light shifted. The sky bled gold along the horizon. Charles drew a breath. I'm not asking you to return to Newport, or to the estate, or to anything I once was. I'm only asking you to believe that everything I am now is because you showed me how to be something else. Harriet felt the wind press against her back, like a question waiting for an answer. Her voice was low, but it carried. I don't want your name. I know. I don't want to be rescued. You never did. She looked at him, her eyes shimmering with all the pain and pride she had carried through the seasons. And I won't be a secret again. You won't, he said, his voice breaking. Not ever. There, on the cliffs above the sea, with no orchestra to cover their silence, no audience to bear witness, Charles dropped to one knee, not in proposal but in surrender, not to tradition, not to expectation, but to truth. I don't have a ring, he said softly. All I have is what's left of me, but it's yours if you want it. Harriet stood still for a long moment. Then, with a single breath, she knelt before him, not in answer, but in understanding. Their foreheads touched. And the silence between them was no longer distance. It was belonging. Late spring settled over Newport like a sigh, its gardens awakening with bold roses and the deep green of well-fed hedgerows. The scent of lilacs drifted down from high balconies, and gulls wheeled over the harbour as if the very city had exhaled after a long, tense winter. But in the drawing rooms of the elite, the air was not so tranquil, for what troubled them was not scandal, but something worse, change. And it came in the form of Harriet Lowell, the seamstress, who now walked through the streets of Newport without a chaperone, without shame, and, perhaps most unthinkable, without apology. The whispers had begun the moment she returned. At first it was disbelief, then outrage, then something dangerously close to admiration. She had opened a small atelier on Pelham Street, in a former bookshop with high windows and uneven floorboards. Inside, the scent of starch and lavender welcomed clients brave enough to cross invisible boundaries. The dresses displayed on mannequins were unlike anything the city's tailors produced, modern but subtle, luxurious but not ostentatious. Each one bore Harriet's signature in the curve of a collar or the unexpected softness of a cuff, and more startling than the gowns themselves was the man sometimes seen leaving the shop, Charles Whitmore. He did not arrive in a carriage. He did not bring flowers. He brought fabric, tea, a newspaper folded with her favorite section already marked. He sat beside her as she drafted sketches on butcher paper, nodding thoughtfully when she explained the tension in a French dart or the weight needed to keep a bodice from collapsing under its own embroidery. He never touched her hand in public, never kissed her cheek. But he looked at her as if no other woman had ever existed. The society pages had a field day. Whitmore courts seamstress in broad daylight. Newport's darling of industry rejects expectations. And still, Charles never made a statement. He didn't have to. He made one with every step he took beside her. Mrs. Adelaide Whitmore had vanished from public view, retreating to her summer home in Bar Harbour with a carefully worded announcement about her nerves. Lavinia Rutherford sent a congratulatory telegram from Paris, though Maggie, reading it aloud, noted that it reeked of champagne and spite. Harriet, for her part, said nothing, not to the papers, not to the women who now smiled through their teeth at her, not even to Maggie, who came by often with updates, warnings, and quiet pride. Harriet kept her focus on the fabric, on the needle, on the future she was stitching with her own hands. She had not spoken of marriage, and Charles had not asked. Until one afternoon, as rain tapped gently on the atelier windows, he arrived without announcement. He wore no coat, only his shirt sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows, as though he had been writing and could not bear to stop. Harriet looked up from her work table, a length of pale peach silk spread before her. "You're early," she said, surprised. "I couldn't wait," he answered, his voice quieter than the rain. He stepped inside, dripping water onto the threshold, and drew something from his pocket. Not a box, not a ring. A handkerchief, ivory lace, delicate and old, hand-stitched monogram in the corner, still faintly perfumed. Harriet recognized it immediately. "Your mother's," she whispered. "She kept it in a silver drawer," he said. "Used it once a year. Told me it was too fine for common illness." He paused. "And I told her it would never be used for anything ordinary." Harriet's breath caught. Charles stepped forward and held it out. "I want no engagement parties," he said. "No orchestra, no announcement in the Times. I want no claims of conquest or alliances between names." She blinked, heart thudding against her ribs. "I want only this," he said. "You. With no pretense, no empire, just the man I have become because you showed me how to begin again." His voice cracked, just slightly. "This isn't a proposal," he added. "It's an acknowledgement. Of all that I failed to do when it mattered most, and of everything I'm willing to give if you'll still have me." Harriet reached for the handkerchief. She held it between her fingers as though it were made of breath, and then slowly she looked up. Her eyes met his, and she nodded, not once, but twice. The kind of nod that closes a door on pain and opens one towards something uncertain but true. That night, she didn't tell Maggie. She didn't light candles. She simply placed the handkerchief in the drawer where she kept her best scissors next to her chalk and measuring tape. 2 weeks later, as the horizon blushed pale gold before the sun's arrival, Harriet Lowell and Charles Whitmore were married in the garden behind her atelier. There were no guests, no orchestra, no carriage procession, only dew-covered roses, the faint rustle of satin, and 2 witnesses, Maggie and an elderly minister with a quivering voice and a kind smile. Harriet wore a gown of her own making, ivory silk with no jewels, no bustle, no train, only a high collar trimmed in lace and sleeves that gathered softly at the wrist. Charles wore his father's waistcoat, and in place of rings they exchanged a vow sewn into cloth, a single stitch on the inside hem of Harriet's sleeve, made by Charles with trembling hands. He had never sewn before, and still, she would never alter it. As the sun rose, bathing the garden in amber light, Charles took her hand, kissed the back of it, and rested his forehead against hers. "I was never lost," he whispered. "I was only waiting." Harriet closed her eyes, and in that moment, beneath the awakening sky, she finally let herself belong, not to his name, not to his house, but to the space between them, a place neither of them had known existed until they dared to cross every boundary to find it. Newport, summer of 1898. The city was not as it had been. Progress had carved its mark into the coastline, replacing horse-drawn carriages with electric trolleys and gaslight with flickering bulbs that burned long into the night. Women walked with bolder steps, their voices louder in town halls and lectures. The air still smelled of salt and roses, but now it also carried the weight of change. Nestled behind a row of flowering dogwoods on Pelham Street, a modest white house with deep green shutters stood quiet in the morning light, its windows open to the sound of gulls and distant laughter. Beside it, the atelier remained, though the brass plaque above the door now read, "Lowell and Whitmore, dressmakers of distinction." Inside, bolts of fabric lined the walls, soft silks and French tulle beside bolder patterns and imported cottons. But on this morning, the workroom sat untouched, its sewing machines silent, for today was not for clients or fittings. Today was for remembering. In the garden behind the house, Harriet Whitmore stood beneath a blooming magnolia, her gloved hands clasped as she watched the preparations unfold. Folding chairs lined the path between rose bushes. A white cloth was draped over a small table, bearing a photograph in a silver frame, and a lace handkerchief carefully pressed beneath it. She had sewn that handkerchief herself years ago. Now it held the initials of a man who had changed her life and whose absence echoed louder each year. 8 years had passed since Charles Whitmore had placed that same handkerchief in her hands, with no ring and no promises, only love, and he had kept that love like a vow stitched into his skin. They had 2 daughters now. Clara, age 6, with Harriet's steady eyes and her father's quiet soul, and Eliza, 4, who was all laughter and defiance, climbing trees in petticoats and learning to embroider only because she wanted to improve on her mother's designs. Charles had left the business world long ago. The Whitmore name had not vanished, but its place in industrial power had been traded for smaller, quieter things: carpentry, charity, teaching workers to read. He had grown roses along the back fence and brewed coffee every morning before the girls woke, and every Thursday, without fail, he delivered fresh flowers to Harriet's shop, setting them in a small blue vase without a word. Until the winter of '97, when the fever came fast and left without mercy. He had whispered her name as he faded, not out of desperation, but out of gratitude. Now 1 year later, friends and neighbors gathered to dedicate a reading room in his memory, built beside the factory school he had funded after stepping away from empire. The room would be filled with books, with music, with lectures on history and design, and above its door, carved in oak, were the words Charles had once said to Harriet in the garden: "You showed me how to begin again." Maggie stood beside Harriet, now married herself, with a toddler on her hip and a quiet strength in her posture. She had never stopped defending Harriet, never stopped believing that the world could shift if someone dared to push. Even Lavinia Rutherford had written, from Vienna, now a baroness by marriage, but by her own admission, lonelier than she had expected. Her letter was brief, but its ink did not bleed bitterness. "You were braver than all of us," it said. "I see that now." The ceremony was short. Clara released a single dove from a wicker cage, her small hands trembling. Eliza scattered petals along the path, unaware of the weight her steps carried, and Harriet, dressed in a simple navy gown, stitched with thread Charles once brought from Italy, stood still as memories passed over her like wind through lace. When the guests had gone and the chairs stood empty, she remained. She sat on the garden bench where they had once read together in silence, her fingers trailing over the wood he had carved. Time had softened her, yes, but not broken her. The grief lived beside the joy now, never vanquished, never bitter, simply woven in. She looked up at the sky and whispered into the quiet, "I kept every promise." And from somewhere deep in the wind, or maybe from within herself, the answer came, not in words, but in warmth. The world had changed, the seasons had passed. But their love, tempered by sorrow, strengthened by truth, had never unraveled, and in the legacy they left behind, it never would. Conclusion. The stitch that held some stories are sewn not with thread, but with courage. Harriet Lowell's journey reminds us that love does not always arrive in grand declarations or glittering ballrooms. Sometimes it comes in silence, in resilience, in the quiet dignity of a woman who dares to believe she is worth more than what the world offers her. She was never invited to belong, so she carved a place for herself, and Charles Whitmore, powerful, broken, proud, found his redemption not in riches or reputation, but in the eyes of the seamstress who saw the man beneath the steel. This is not just a romance. It is a story of becoming, of healing, of choosing love even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. If this story touched your heart, if you felt something stir with each word, tell us in the comments. Let us know you made it to the very end by writing "stitched," a single word that holds the weight of 1,000 emotions. Share with someone who believes in second chances. Tag a friend who needs a reminder that love, real love, doesn't demand perfection. And don't miss the other heartfelt tales I've left for you in the video cards above. Your support keeps these stories alive. Thank you for watching and for feeling every moment with us. Until the next story. With all my heart, Emma.